Good afternoon, everyone. We're recording our session now. Thank you for joining us. I know we'll have some participants and registrants coming on as we start right now. We will just go through a little bit of housekeeping. We are doing our best to make sure that everything is accessible as we work through this today. If there are any technical issues after our event, we will address them in post-production for a library and we'll send those videos out. So we appreciate any patience that you can give us during that. Today is our fourth and final panel discussion on our series around disclosure and disability. We've had 3 others so far on employment, education, and also COVID. So as we went through these panels, we talked about various issues throughout each panel. And today is the day that we'll talk about some of the questions that we've had from both people who had participated in those panels, as well as some questions that even our panelists have thought of after our events. So today I would like to introduce myself. My name is Katrin Haldeman. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. And I am a white woman with brown hair. It's a little bit curly, and I am wearing a white button-down t-shirt today with a collar. I would like to introduce the rest of our panelists. We have Brandy Tomlinson, Allison Lynch, and Sabina Khan. Each one of them will give you a little bit of an idea of who they are, as well as what their panels were about. So if we could please start with Sabina, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Katrin. Good afternoon. My name is Sabina Khan. I am a staff attorney at DRNY's PAMI unit, which stands for Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness. My preferred pronouns are she and her. I am a South Asian woman with navy jacket. I'm wearing a navy jacket and a button-down red collared shirt. I am sitting in front of a white wall. Last time I had the pleasure of co-moderating with our director, Mark Fliebner, the disclosure of disabilities in the workplace panel. You can watch the entire panel on our YouTube channel if you missed it, but briefly as a summary, we had 3 panelists who shared their very unique and different lived experiences or clinical experiences, observations, and recommendations surrounding the issues of disclosing one's disabilities to an employer. We had Dr. Donna Walton, who's the founder and president of the Divas with Disabilities Project, which is committed to increasing the participation and representation of Black and Brown women with disabilities in the media. Dr. Walton shared her lived experiences as an above the knee left knee amputee. We also had Philip Llanos, who was the clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at John Jay College, and whose research shows that stigma, particularly when it comes to disabilities related to mental health, negatively impacts the successful outcomes and community participation of individuals who are stigmatized. And last but not least, we had John Robinson, president and CEO of a business called Our Abilities Incorporated, a web-based tech company dedicated specifically to building employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities. And John shared his lived experiences as a quadruple amputee. Obviously, it was very impactful hearing all of our panelists speak. There was a shared view and common theme among our panelists that stigma not only causes individuals to feel hesitant to disclose their disabilities, but employers can be either the contributors of stigmatization, depending on how they act and react to their employees or applicants' disabilities, or they can be allies and work to dismantle stigma by providing a supportive and accepting environment, and by being educated about how they should be more accommodating and recognizing the macro level and micro aggressions that people with disabilities face in the workplace. In the same token, the panelists shared the perspective that people with disabilities can be their own advocates and hold the power to change stigmatization by holding employers accountable and by disclosing disabilities and asking for the accommodations that they need and that they are very much entitled to by law.
Sabina, thank you so much. And we'll come back to you to talk about some questions from your panel. We're going to go to Brandy next. And Brandy, if you could please also tell us a little bit about yourself and your panel on education.
Absolutely. My name is Brandy Tomlinson. I'm an attorney in the PAMI program. I'm the white woman wearing a gray jacket with white doors in the background. I had the pleasure of my apologies. My pronouns are she and hers. And I had the pleasure of moderating the education panel. We had one parent of a child with mental illness who is residing in a residential treatment facility. We also had a post-secondary student who's now a law school student. And then our third panelist that we had was a former DNY intern who is now an attorney. And what we really spoke about during my panel was we really focused on disclosing your disability at the post-secondary level. And then we also focused on the child find obligations of school districts to identify and locate students with disability and ensuring that they're receiving special education services. And we really focused on, parents being advocates when school districts do not actually child find these students with disabilities. So I look forward to talking more about that with you.
Great. And it was such an informative panel as our first one on employment was. Allison, let's go to you next. If you could please tell us a little bit about yourself as well as your panel.
Sure. Thank you, Katrin. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allison Lynch. I am also a staff attorney in DRNY's PAMI program. And last week, I had the pleasure of hosting a panel dedicated to the topic of COVID-19 and non-obvious disabilities and disclosure. In that panel, we had three really remarkable individuals who were speaking and talking a lot about topics that really resonate with a lot of people throughout these past 18 months of the pandemic. We had Laquanya Hagray, who is a licensed mental health counselor who's been working with a lot of individuals who are very much affected by the pandemic, the restrictions, the anxiety that some of that can produce, as well as some kind of other concerns that have come to light in terms of substance abuse and domestic violence issues that have been severely impacted because of the way that COVID has really changed our lives and the way that we function in the world now. Laquanya really discussed a lot about how to find that support network amongst this kind of new virtual world and how that in particular impacts people with non-obvious disabilities, both physical and mental. We also had a panelist by the name of Michael Letman, who is a self-advocate and identifies as an individual with autism. He spoke very powerfully about the impacts that the pandemic have had on his own mental health and his own work prospects and really the massive changes that he's faced in his life. He was very candid about the fact that his anxiety about COVID, about being outside, about being around people has continued to increase and has really led to him feeling like the only safe space for him is inside his home. And I think he spoke to what a lot of people are feeling these days, where the media and the unknowns that we're still continuing to face in the pandemic are really exacerbating a lot of those anxieties that the world is probably feeling in many different ways. And Michael was very articulately and effectively able to kind of channel all of that into a description of how he's been living day to day and how he's been adapting and coping and what some of his strategies are. So I know everyone there was very appreciative of his openness and his willingness to truly disclose all of this. Our final panelist was Dr. Andy Cohen, who is a pediatric psychologist at URMC. And he talked a lot about the challenges that parents and children in particular are facing if that child has a non-obvious disability. And he also kind of reminded us that the categorization of disability and challenge can be a lot broader than just a particular on-paper diagnosis. There are a number of socioeconomic factors, factors having to do with race and class and gender and identity, and all of those things contribute to your ability to access healthcare, to feel as if that healthcare is readily available and helpful to you, and to feel as though there are enough resources in your corner or your child's corner to continue to live in a way that feels comfortable for you, that allows your child to continue education, to not have that struggle of feeling so isolated while at the same time dealing with some sort of disability. So a real theme of resilience is what emerged from my panel, and I'm incredibly appreciative of everyone who was there and willing to share.
It was such a great panel. And Allison, I want to draw attention to something that that you said, a term that you used that I think it would be really helpful for our audience to know why we say non-obvious or seen or unseen when we're talking about disability, as opposed to oftentimes we hear the word invisible associated with a non-obvious disability. And that's something that, you know, as we go through all of our work here at DRNY, when we talk about language, I think it's just important to draw attention to that, because this is the forum. So can you talk to us a little bit about using that word, that term specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will also say this is something that I discussed in my panel. I am an individual who also identifies as someone with non-obvious disabilities. I have a vision disorder, and I also have some form of COVID-related asthma. There's no great name for it yet, but in terms of using that word, something that I'm learning when people talk about invisible disabilities versus non-obvious disabilities is it may seem nuanced, but in reality, when you're saying invisible, the erasure, I think, that a lot of people with disabilities feel can happen sometimes and can be problematic in cases where someone will come up to you and say, oh, you don't look like you have a disability. You don't look like you can't see very well. That's not what I'm going for. What I'm going for is being able to have an open conversation about something that isn't obvious, but is still very much a part of an identity. So rather than try and kind of shove it under a rug, call it invisible, pretend it doesn't exist, using that terminology of non-obvious, I think for a lot of people better speaks to the fact that a lot of these panelists, myself included, can walk into a room and not have people immediately pinpoint what your disability is, but it's still there and it's still a part of how you function. And it's not something that we are actively trying to hide.
And if any of other panelists want to add to that, certainly you can. This is, it's such a great forum to discuss how we use language and how it interacts with all that we're doing. So as we move to the next questions, Sabina, I'm going to come back to you. We talked about stigma in all of the panels, but we talked about the importance in the employment context. This was something that John Robinson talked a lot about, not only as his experience as an employer or a recruiter, but also as an employee. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of addressing this in the employment context, and why is it crucial to successful employment for people at any stage?
Absolutely. So just to first define what we mean by stigma, it generally involves negative attitudes or discriminatory beliefs against someone based on a distinguishing characteristic, such as based on somebody's disability. So we heard Professor Llanos noted that in his research, it shows that when someone's been discredited because of negative stereotypes, then their future and their past actions can be discounted based on them being viewed through this lens. And in turn, this creates a tremendous amount of anxiety in people who have a stigmatized condition because they feel that their behavior is under a microscope and their work is no longer being viewed the same as their colleagues who don't have a disability. And so when we don't address stigma and when we just sweep it under the rug, well, now we're not just preventing ourselves from holding accountable those employers who have false and negative stereotypes and concerns about hiring someone with a disability, but we're also failing to acknowledge how people with disabilities are impacted and therefore further marginalizing people with disabilities and preventing progress. Like it was discussed during the panel, there are people who unfortunately end up avoiding seeking work because of this stigma, even though they want to be employed. And this in turn has a ripple effect throughout the person's life. And Professor Llanos noted that clinically it impacts symptoms as well. And I want to point out that the Department of Labor just came out with these statistics in 2020, which shows that across all age groups, disabilities were much less likely to be people with disabilities were much less likely to be employed than those without a disability, and they were more likely to be employed only part-time compared to people without a disability. Interestingly enough, employed people with a disability were more likely to be self-employed than those without a disability. So there are obviously different variables as to why there's this gap, but it's unacceptable when you realize that very likely a large reason why these statistics are what they are is because we as a society have a lot of work to do in dismantling stigma and not just disclosing disabilities in the workplace, but also demanding that employers provide reasonable accommodations as they are required to do under the ADA. Now, some people might say with the self-employment statistics, oh, that's great. People with disabilities are more likely to be their own boss. Sure, but the question is that a choice? Because it should be a choice, right? To be self-employed. Or is it that many people with disabilities feel that they don't have a choice but to be self-employed because there are just not enough employers that are accommodating their needs? So to conclude, we need to flip the script and recognize that you are not creating an undue burden by disclosing your disability and by requesting an accommodation, but quite the contrary. People with disabilities have just as many skills and talents to offer employers. And in acknowledging the existence of the disability, individuals will be better employers and provide positive work product because their environment is meeting their needs.
And I think we talked a little bit about lived experience with each panelist. And one of the things that we talked about or we heard about was also the intersectionality of the entire community, as we call it, people with disabilities. This is certainly not a broad stroke that we can brush with, that there is an intersectional component that also needs to be addressed, and the lived experience not only of our panelists, but of people that they have also, whether employed or worked with. Those were some stories that had a lot of impact. Talk to us about why it's so important for us to hear about these lived experience, experiences, and how can that better inform employers as well as employees as they move through the process from interview to employment?
So just first starting off with the issue with intersectionality, right? I think that that's unfortunately not discussed enough. So I'm really glad that Dr. Walton had brought it up. She made a really important point. She said, as a Black woman with a disability, she experiences a trifecta of discrimination. So being Black, female, disabled, she wouldn't know whether she was being denied employment because she's Black, because she's female, or because of her disability. And oftentimes it's the combination of discriminatory views related to not just the disability, but also race, gender identity. And so there needs to be space to discuss disability discrimination from an intersectional lens as well. In terms of the lived experiences of two of our panelists, interestingly, we had Dr. Walton, who indicated that she is somebody who wears a prosthesis, and so her disability is not always apparent. And then we had John Robinson, who indicated that his disability is obvious once he steps into a room, but both of them struggled initially with obtaining positions that they were clearly highly qualified for. We heard Dr. Walton's story of how she had an opportunity to be a news reporter at a television station, but during the interview, one of the first questions she was asked was, how would you run to get the answers to a story given your disability? And then we had John Robinson, who was unemployed 4 years after graduating with a degree in TV, radio, and film. And he was watching his friends with the same GPA, the same internships, the same references and professors obtain big jobs in the media while he was unemployed for 4 years. And so even though these specific experiences conveyed by Dr. Walton and by John occurred many years ago, the statistics and the unemployment rate of people with disabilities, it makes it clear that there's a lot of progress that needs to be made, not just in encouraging people to disclose their disabilities, but also in demanding that employers create supportive environments that welcome the opportunity for disclosure. And it shouldn't be this way. We had the American Disabilities Act passed in 1990, over 30 years ago, and we're still sitting here having this discussion on disclosure. And it's important that we do, because our society is not where it needs to be when it comes to accommodating individuals with disabilities in the workplace and beyond. But on a positive note, there's a lot of progress that can be made, that's being made thanks to the work and advocacy of people like our panelists. Both of these panelists took their experiences and they created platforms for advocacy and change in the workplace environment to give people with disabilities a voice and opportunity. And even though we haven't adopted a successful anti-stigma campaign like the one Professor Janos mentioned that occurred in England called Time to Change program, which showed positive outcomes in reducing stigma, we are moving in the right direction. For example, you have John Robinson and his company now speaking to and educating and working with major companies like Allied Bank and Microsoft on these issues. And all of the panelists agreed that part of the issue is we need people with disabilities to be included in leadership and senior positions. John gave the example of Microsoft, which has a chief accessibility officer, and as a result, products, services, employment, and outreach include people with disabilities in every instance. And so I think just based on the conversations that we had at the panel, it seems also employers need to be more educated about how to create a stigma-free environment. And as advocates, we also have a lot of work to do with educating those employers.
And you brought up some good points about accommodations and what it looks like and how we need to do better in a lot of areas. But what happens if there is a person who has requested an accommodation and their employer is not forthcoming with that? What does that look like, not only as an attorney, but If we have a client, certainly that is talking to us about that. But for the person themselves who is being denied an accommodation, what are the next steps? How do we process that? And obviously, I would say that DRNY is a resource, but let's just talk a little bit about what that process is like.
Sure. So obviously, every case is going to look different, and the process is not going to be exactly the same for every person across the board, but I'll give a general overview with the understanding that the process is not going to look exactly the same every time. So let's say you've been denied an accommodation based on your disability, you call DRNY, you speak to our intake team, and then eventually you will, in this circumstance, be connected to an attorney like myself. I will review the concerns, ask for information related to your disability and your job, and ask what accommodations you requested. I will ask for any documentation that you may have, including any written communications from your employer denying your reasonable accommodation, any medical documentation, such as a letter from your provider stating that you have a disability and that you're in need of a reasonable accommodation. If you don't have a letter from your provider, generally, I will advise you to be assessed by your provider and ask your provider to write a letter requesting an accommodation from your employer. And I will then write an advocacy letter on your behalf requesting that the employer requesting a reasonable accommodation and educating the employer that under the federal and mirroring state and local laws, they are required to make reasonable accommodations to an otherwise qualified applicant or employee with a disability. And the only exception really is where an employer can show that there's undue hardship. Employers are required to engage in what's called cooperative dialogue within a reasonable amount of time once an individual has requested an accommodation. So this means engaging in good faith written or oral dialogue about the person's need for an accommodation. So generally, once I send the letter as an attorney, I will hear back from the employer, or usually the employer's attorneys, who will then engage in some dialogue, sometimes good faith dialogue and sometimes questionable, but we will try and come up with a settlement or a solution. And if we can't come to an agreement on the accommodation, then it doesn't end there. You are entitled to file with a complaint with an agency. There are 3 different agencies. If you live in New York State, it's the New York State City Commission on Human Rights. They are specifically for complaints processed in New York City. So if you live in New York City, you could go to the New York City Commission on Human Rights. You have the New York State Division of Human Rights, which is obviously statewide. And then you have the federal agency called the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, also known as the EEOC. So if you're not sure which agency to go to, you can contact the agency directly and they will generally advise you. These agencies also have what is called dual filing. So say I file with the City Commission on Human Rights. If a matter that you file with the commission falls within the jurisdiction of the federal EEOC, they will more than likely dual file your complaint with the EEOC through what's called their work share agreement. So you don't need to request that it be dual filed, as it should happen automatically. But of course, you can ask the agency after their investigation whether they will dual file.
Thanks so much for that information, Sabina, and the information on your panel. It really was just filled with good information, and the video from that will be available along with the rest of them at the end of this. So Brandy, I want to move to you. We had a lot of really great discussion in the education panel, especially as we're getting ready, if not already starting school in the next week or so. There was a lot of information that certainly parents have been dealing with over the last 18 months. And so I think there was a little bit of energy in that for your panel. And as you spoke about in the beginning, you were talking about the secondary level school districts. talk to us a little bit about what can a parent do when they think their child has a disability and is not being identified in the school district. I know that this is a big topic, especially in the first couple of weeks of school, right? You want your child to start off right. Parents want to start off on the right foot with teachers and administrators. So let's just talk a little bit about that, especially in terms of we're starting a new school year, and this is super new because some students haven't been in a classroom in almost a whole year.
You're right. This is perfect timing with school beginning. Some have already started, some will be beginning next week. So these school districts, they have what's called a child find obligation. And what that means is school districts are required to actively identify your child with a disability. So what does that look like? It could be a teacher recognizing that perhaps there's a student who is taking a little bit longer than other students in the class to complete an assignment, or perhaps a student is struggling with reading and they're not reading at their grade level. It could be a variety of different things. And it could also be other individuals recognizing that a child may have a disability. It doesn't have to be a teacher. It could be even a gym teacher, for example, recognizing that a child is having a difficult time following instruction. And oftentimes school districts are missing these students, particularly students with mental illness, particularly from color and low income communities. And the reason is because there's a stereotype that children, particularly younger children, there's a stereotype to say that it quickly to say that it's a behavioral problem, not that it's a mental illness. And so what these teachers and school districts will do, even the CSE, which is the Committee on Special Education, what they will do is that they will brush it off and say, no, it's just a behavioral problem. So what should you do if you think the school district is missing your child? The first thing you want to do is you want to make a referral to the Committee on Special Education. And a lot of parents do not know how to do that. And I don't blame them, because it's not like you're going to walk into the school district and you're going to see a sign that says special education or Committee on Special Education. So what I recommend you do is you can ask anyone. It can be your child's general ed teacher, the music teacher, the principal. You can say, I think my child has a disability. I think they may qualify for an IEP or 504 plan, and I think they need accommodation. And that's really the first step that you want to do. And when you make this request, you want to make sure that you're able to articulate why you think your child needs a disability. Because oftentimes, if the school district hasn't identified your child as someone that may need accommodation, you're going to have to make that case. And to make that case, you can point to a variety of factors. You could point to family history. If you have a family history, for example, of anxiety or any kind of learning disorder. If your child is getting bad grades, you can indicate that these report cards with the bad grades indicate a disability. If your child is getting, for example, if a child is getting really bad grades on exams, it may be that perhaps the child has anxiety and maybe they need time and a half. Because oftentimes you need that extra time. It could even be a processing disorder. You want to point all those things on. And, if you have any kind of, every year children need to get annual physicals done. If you have noted to your pediatrician, or your pediatrician has noted that perhaps your child may have a disability, you want to raise that. You want to say, my pediatrician is concerned that, my child had an eye exam in the office and they couldn't recognize the letters. Those are all the signs you want to make sure you tell the school district about.
Sorry, I was still on mute there. So we were just talking about secondary education, but there's a difference in the post-secondary level. Self-identification is the next step. Talk to us a little bit about this requirement and how it differs from the secondary level child find obligations that school districts have. What are some good resources or just processes that students need to think about as far as self-identification?
So once you've graduated from high school and you're ready to go to college, the very first thing you need to do is you need to identify yourself as a disability. And unfortunately, many children do not know this because they're so used to having mom and dad or the legal guardian advocate for them when they were in high school, middle school, elementary school. And nobody teaches you in school these advocacy skills that, hey, when you go to college, you need to let them know. And colleges don't even need to seek you out like they do at the secondary level. So it's very important as soon as you get that acceptance letter, and even before you begin school, if it's possible, you want to reach out to every college has what's called Disability Services Office. And if they don't, they should have someone called ADA coordinator or even 504 coordinator. You want to reach out to them and you want to say, I'm a student with a disability. Now, let's say you're not sure if you need accommodation. I would still let them know. So that way that you can begin the dialogue with them and they can discuss it with you as well and talk about any concerns that you may have. So that's really the key. It really is you need to self-identify, and that's the difference between them.
I think that's a really good point, and something that maybe our audience would not be aware of, that you can certainly contact the college with the acceptance letter, even before your student gets on campus. There's so many things that change when your student leaves the home and is now on a campus and under a college's care, really, long-term for the first time. And of course, this is going to cross into Allison's panel as well, but COVID changed everything for students on campus. And so when your students are on campus, and as you said, they may not have the supports necessarily, daily supports of their parents or their parents intervening on their behalf. As a student, what should they be looking for or thinking about if they believe that they're having a mental health crisis, or even if their parents think that they may be? I think COVID really highlighted this, and that it was something that was very extreme. Students were away from their parents and they were on campus for the first time and maybe couldn't even leave their dorms. So what are some things that they could think about in terms of having a mental health crisis on campus and post-secondary?
And you raise a very good point. For many of these students, it's the very first time that they're away from home. And on top of that, you have the COVID-19 pandemic. So absolutely, there's going to be a lot of anxiety that students are experiencing that could be exacerbating the mental health issues and leading to a mental health crisis. So right off the bat, if you feel that you are in a mental health crisis and you are starting to miss classes, you're missing your assignments, you've missed a midterm, or you just completely, you're not staying on top of things, you want to reach out to disability services. And the reason why you want to do that is because you don't want to risk being dismissed from the school, but also because colleges are required to accommodate you. And by accommodation, you can take a leave of absence as a reasonable accommodation. And the reason why it's so important to look or even consider a leave of absence is because students with mental health crises, you may be hospitalized and you don't know how long you're going to be in the hospital for, or maybe you're discharged from the hospital, but you're still dealing with your crisis. You may not be ready to go back to your studies. This can often be the case, particularly for students who may be dealing with depression. It may be hard to get out of bed first thing in the morning and you've missed your classes. So you want to go out to disability services, talk to them about taking a leave of absence. And you want to make sure, and I caution against this, because a lot of colleges, for some reason, they're not offering a leave of absence as a reasonable accommodation to students. They're telling students with, particularly students that are having mental health crises, they're saying you should withdraw. Well, the problem with withdrawing is you're no longer a student. You're going to owe a lot of financial aid. I've had many clients reach out to me saying, just got out of the hospital. My school told me to withdraw, and now they sent me a bill for $3,000, and they don't have any money to pay for it. And it's so heart-wrenching. If you could just talk about getting a leave of absence with disability services, you'll be saving yourself a lot of grief and a lot of discrimination. And a lot of times these colleges, they don't even understand the difference between withdrawal and a leave of absence. There have been a couple of cases where I've had to educate colleges and say, no, you can't force students to withdraw. You have to offer that leave of absence. And so what will happen is you take your leave of absence, you focus on your mental health treatment, you get yourself well, and then you can come back to school and you're still a student. You don't have to reapply. You generally do not owe any financial aid. It's a much better solution. And unfortunately, I just see it happening so often where students are just not getting that.
Right, and the information isn't being communicated to them, which is, as you said, sometimes the college themselves, they don't even know the difference. So again, another great panel. And Allison, we're going to move on to you. Of course, COVID has never really gone away. We talk about how we hear people talking about post-COVID, but we're really not post-COVID. We are post-shutdown or post-lockdown right now, but COVID is still very much in the news. We're talking about variants every day, vaccines. COVID is really ever present. So certainly it's still in the air and is still affecting people from the very beginning. So let's talk about what we've learned about how the pandemic has impacted people with non-obvious disabilities and really the long term of that. Right. And as you talked about in the beginning, like a long haul COVID is not just physical. There's an impact that has reached the population in a very different way. And how has that really, what have we learned about it? And how has that been translating into what we're seeing in behavior?
That's a really good question. And there's probably another entire panel's worth of discussion that can be had around that. But as you said, we are still very much in the midst of a pandemic. It might feel like a different stage, but we are very much still in it and having to be cognizant and having to be maybe feeling a little bit more on high alert than we have in the past pre-pandemic. And all of that in conjunction with maybe still not being back to work full time, maybe dealing with anxiety about kids returning to school in the fall, whatever your personal circumstances are, all of that is leading to a lot of either exacerbation of conditions that may have existed pre-COVID that an individual felt they were able to handle pretty well, maybe with therapy, maybe with medication, maybe with their own way of dealing with their mental health. But then we're also adding to that an entirely new group of people who have come forward since the pandemic and said, this event has caused me to develop a non-obvious disability. In a lot of cases, that is a new mental health diagnosis. It could be anxiety, it could be depression. There are a number of things that the isolation, the unsuredness of this whole thing have brought out in a number of people. And so we have a lot of people in the population, kids, adults, and everyone in between, who are dealing with either what feel like worse or more exacerbated symptoms of a condition they were already familiar with, or development of new symptoms that can be just as scary and just as concerning because someone's not used to it and they don't know how to handle it. And now, on top of all of this, they have to figure out how to navigate mental health care in the midst of an ongoing pandemic. They can't just call up a therapist and say, I'll be in next week. There might be a lot more hoops to jump through and a lot more concerns health and safety wise before they start their own journey towards taking care of their mental health. So a lot of what we've learned has been how to adequately address the concerns of people with both known disabilities that have changed in some way due to the pandemic, as well as adding on to the caseload of mental health providers, individuals who are now saying, look, this has really changed something for me, and I feel like I need a little bit more help. So we're in this world where so much is still unsure, and we're still trying to figure out and learn so much. And I think we're going to be here for a while. And the individuals on my panel all kind of confirmed this in their own way through talking about their patient load and what they've been seeing and what they've been hearing, as well as our individual Michael with lived experience saying, I still don't feel comfortable. I still don't feel like I can relax in any way. And I think that's echoed in a lot of ways throughout the more general population.
Agreed. There was so much feedback from the panelists on how this has really changed so much professionally, personally, emotionally, and what they're experiencing and seeing. And so COVID brought a lot of different aspects that were certainly negative to everyone. However, we also went virtual, right? Even our panel today, the 3 panels before that, able to do live virtual events have changed some things for people with non-obvious disabilities. So let's talk a little bit about some of the positive things that have come out of this, but also there have been some other negative parts of going virtual. Just talk a little bit about both sides of that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something that people are talking about a lot on one side or another, but we're going to have to kind of reconcile with this as we hopefully move forward soon into more controlled reopening and more comfort with trying to get things back to the way they were. In terms of going virtual, I think a lot of our panelists, both on my panel and on others, have confirmed that in some cases, it might serve a benefit for people with non-obvious disabilities in terms of things like job interviews, where maybe you don't feel comfortable disclosing right away. And maybe through a virtual interview, you feel more comfortable walking into the room, so to speak, and presenting yourself in a way that doesn't force you to disclose or force you to have a conversation that maybe you want to have down the road, but don't feel is entirely appropriate to have right now. This kind of virtual setting might really help build confidence in people who normally wouldn't feel comfortable going into a first interview and being concerned about disclosure. But on the flip side, there are obviously a lot of concerns with continuing to keep things virtual that Dr. Cohen on my panel in particular talked about, and that has to do with isolation and socialization, especially where kids are concerned. And obviously that was a huge component of why parents were really, really urging schools to reopen, because it was a challenge, as anyone with kids knows, to watch your child go from being in a classroom setting every day, interacting with peers, having that really positive experience with teachers and other students, to sitting at home by themselves in front of a screen for 8 hours a day and missing out on so many of those things that probably all of us would have taken for granted during our school years. So the challenges obviously are that a reliance on this virtual world can hurt people with mental illness or anxiety or depression who maybe need that contact, that one-on-one in-person contact with other people, and are not able to get it because of COVID, because of safety, because of maybe other underlying health conditions that they have. And so they're continuing to face this burden of not being able to get that full social interaction, that full kind of human contact experience that I think a lot of us can empathize with in terms of missing. The other really interesting point about the virtual world now, as LaQuania on my panel in particular pointed out, is that social media has become such a lifeline to a lot of people in many ways. And although that's another very polarizing topic in itself that we talked about a little bit, the presence of online support groups, online chat groups, in particular for individuals with disabilities, has been a real benefit to a lot of people who maybe have some of those concerns about being isolated. The next best thing, as LaQuania said, is being able to connect with people who can truly understand what someone else is going through because they're going through something similar. So people who aren't able to attend in-person support groups, or maybe who never had the chance to do that before the pandemic, are finding it very helpful to interact with people online and be able to kind of put a question out there and say, hey, I'm dealing with this. Has anyone else had this experience? What's worked for you? Is there a provider that you know of in this area who does a really good job with this in particular? So using social media, using that virtual world to establish connections is something that I think a lot of us have seen a positive trend for. And I think, as we discussed on my panel, we hope that that trend continues. And I think we all are thinking that it probably will, because so many people have been taking advantage of it in so many different ways. So, there are clearly so many benefits to having that available. But I think the next step, as we all work towards this reopening, is going to be figuring out how do we balance that really good place we've found on the internet, on this community, with now moving back towards a model of being able to meet in person and keeping those two things at a level that works for people who want to take advantage of one or the other or both.
That's a really good point. The balance is obviously going to be driven by the individual, but having the experience of going back to having some possible in-person interactions is going to have to be part of how we move forward globally. This certainly wasn't something that just affected one area or of one state or one city. So certainly there is a global connection that we have all experienced this. So finding the balance is certainly going to be something we all find ourselves doing. And let's just talk a little bit about long haul COVID, specifically being added to the list of disabilities that are going to be covered under the ADA. What does this look like in practice for people who have a new diagnosis and they feel like they might be facing discrimination because of that?
Absolutely. That's, I think, something that obviously, as disability rights attorneys and advocates, has been on the forefront of a lot of our minds as we've seen some of these guidances emerging. And to give a little bit more context, what this means is that there have been basically orders put in place to treat long haul COVID the same way that any other type of disability is treated in this country. And Sabina did a really great job of kind of breaking down what that looks like in terms of employment discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And now, because the ADA covers so much, including employment, it covers school issues, housing, transportation, basically anything that could implicate a disability or a claim of disability discrimination. What a lot of us are looking at is, how does long haul COVID fit into that model? Because now it has to be treated by employers, educators, city officials as just as any other type of disability needs to be treated under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in practice right now, that's going to be a little challenging because, as you saw earlier, when I was trying to fumble for a description of what my particular long haul COVID issue looks like, there's not great names yet. You have the broad categorization of long haul COVID, but as many of us know, so many things can fit into that. That could be only respiratory. It could be only mental. It could be a combination of both. It could be something neurological that we haven't entirely figured out how to test for yet. There are so many ways that COVID affects people beyond that 2 or 3 week period of initial illness that can all be categorized as long haul COVID. And that's going to be the challenge in figuring out, how is this a disability and how is it accommodated, managed, and accepted in the same way that other maybe traditionally better known disabilities are. So for example, it's very easy for me because of my vision disorder to say, I know this is what I need. This is the condition that I have, and this is how to deal with it. But someone who's recovering from COVID, who suddenly has anxiety, brain fog, things that they don't know enough about, that they're still kind of undergoing some maybe potentially experimental treatments for, medication trials for, they don't know how that's going to impact them as they start to return to work, as they start to return to school, when they get stressed about final exams. So they probably don't have as clear an understanding as someone like me with a pretty basic vision disorder, where you can go in and say, this is what I need. This is how you can accommodate that. And that conversation is over. The challenge with long haul COVID is going to be that it's still changing. Our understanding of it is going to continue to change for a long time. And we have to make sure that that doesn't in any way lessen the impact that accommodations are going to have in a person's life. We need to make sure that employers and educators and anyone else is fully aware of obligations under the ADA to not just put a set of accommodations in place that are asked for, but to also be willing to go through this process of changing it up if that needs to happen, because this is something where we don't know what this is going to look like in 6 months, a year, 5 years. We have to continue to be flexible with the accommodations, with the medical documentation that we're seeking, and everything in place that will help the individual over time. And because we don't know that, I think in practice, as we work on more and more of these cases, we're going to find that the general public maybe needs a little bit more teaching about the nature of these types of disabilities that do change over time, that do need different ways of managing them. And as attorneys and advocates, we have to be very much aware that this, like many other disabilities, isn't necessarily stable in the way that other things we've dealt with in the past has been. So having that recognition, I think, is going to be a really important part of how we kind of integrate this long haul COVID into our repertoire of disabilities that we are helping people accommodate.
That's right. There's still so much that's unknown. And I like using the term flexibility for you to say that we all need to be a little bit flexible in this and wherever we are in our lives. So I appreciate all of the information, not only from you, Allison, but also Brandy and Sabina. All three panels were just fantastic. And as I said in the beginning, the videos from all of these panels will be available shortly, and we will have them up on our YouTube channel. So we'll make them available for everyone. I want to thank everyone for their time today. This was such a great discussion, and certainly these are discussions that will continue because they're certainly not small subjects by any means. They have a lot of different components and moving parts. So hopefully we'll be revisiting them all someday, maybe in a few months or maybe next year around the same time. But thank you all so much for your time and participation. And in the interest of everyone's time, we're just about at 4 o'clock. So thank you, everyone. It was great to have you today.